We can't go through every aspect of your report, Charlie, but I want to pick out some of the key issues. 12 months ago, you spoke about post-COVID torpor in prisons, sort of emerging from the pandemic, but there was still, huge amounts of inactivity, not enough purposeful activity going on. And again, that is something that I think remains your sort of key theme this year. Has anything really improved or changed?
Well, no, this has been very disappointing. We were very worried about the amount of purposeful activity going on within prisons a year ago, Danny, and we at one stage thought we were seeing some green shoots. We saw better outcomes in Park in South Wales. We saw better outcomes in at Coldingley in Surrey. We also saw slightly better outcomes in one or two other prisons, such as Elmley. But generally, it's an enormous concern that prisons continue to be far too little activity going on. Prisoners locked in their cells or on the wings without enough to do. Prisoners underemployed. Prisons continuing to run split or very limited regimes. And classrooms, farms, gardens, workshops, very often empty or with very few people. There was a very telling photograph in that video. I think those were taken mainly from HMP Deerbolt, where there are fantastic facilities, but when we inspected, there was almost nothing going on there. And our biggest worry is that if people are not getting the support they need to be rehabilitated, if they're not getting the support they need to get work when they come out, the danger is that they just get back into the cycle of reoffending, and we end up creating more victims and increasing pressures on an already strained prison system.
And what do you put this down to? What are the main reasons for this sort of inactivity? I think you talk about a range of issues, but leadership is one of them.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what we found in some, for example, recently we inspected HMP Stocken in the East Midlands. They've got a really troubled staffing situation at that jail. They haven't got enough officers, nothing like the amount that they need. Nevertheless, because there was a really ambitious governor who was really encouraging progress, what we saw is large numbers of prisoners moving around the jail, the sort of free flow that we would have seen in the old days, but going to purposeful activity. And what's really important to emphasize at a place like Stocken is levels of violence were no higher at Stocken, remain some of the lowest levels of violence in any Cat C prison. But in this reporting period, we've noted jails like Deerbolt, jails like Lancaster Farms, jails like Ramby, who don't have necessarily such severe staffing pressures as elsewhere, but and have got some very good facilities at those prisons, but nevertheless, prisoners aren't getting out and they're not getting into activities. Sometimes it's to do with the numbers of officers, sometimes it's to do with the numbers of trainers or teachers within prisons, but sometimes it's simply to do with the fact that there hasn't been the drive within jails or from the centre to really get things going.
So leadership problems, but I think you mentioned in your report that there are 20 or 30 visionary governors, which is probably quite a small number compared to the overall number of prisons. And you singled out, I think at an earlier report, Paul Newton, who's turned around Birmingham. Can you tell us a bit about what he has done there that perhaps could serve as an example for others?
Yeah, I mean, Birmingham was in an appalling state when we inspected it in the past. It was, we gave it ones, our lowest scores across the board in each of the areas. It was incredibly dangerous. Staff were frightened to come to work. It was really being run as much by prisoners as it was by staff. Drug abuse and debt and violence were enormously high. When we went back to that jail, we found a prison that had been transformed. That what Paul had done is come in. He'd got a real grip on getting the basics right. So making sure that prisoners were getting the things they need to get through the day, getting bedding, getting sheeting, making sure that places were reasonably clean and tidy. All those things really matter to prisoners. But also what Paul did was re-energize his staff and give them the support and training that they need in order that they were able to deal with prisoners much more confidently. What Paul did is he took advantage of the hiatus that came from lockdowns in order to really transform the way that the prison was operating. So great to see an improvement like that. And we've seen that in other jails. Hewell in the West Midlands, again, is another jail where an excellent governor, Ralph Lubkowski, again, has helped to transform that prison. But even in those jails, we're still concerned about the level of activity that's going on. So great that there have been reductions in violence, but nevertheless, we need to see more activity in reception prisons as well as Cat C prisons that we've been particularly concerned about.
But I was quite struck by this fact that there just aren't enough governors who have sort of have the leadership skills that Paul Newton and some others have done. So what can be done to sort of increase the volume of governors who have that? Or are there some measures that the government has to take to give governors perhaps more autonomy, or give them the confidence to be able to make the changes necessary?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think the level of control from the centre increased enormously at COVID, and one can understand that at the beginning. But I think I talked to lots of governors who felt that level of control was maintained for too long afterwards, and they were itching to get things up and running. There are many really impressive and inspiring governors out there, and we're constantly staggered not only by the quality of governors but also staff within prisons. But ultimately, when you compare the sorts of freedoms that I had as a head teacher, a classic thing is that governors don't get to recruit their own officer staff. So the first time they meet new officers working in their jail is the day they first turn up on the wing for the first time. Now, the idea as a head teacher that I would have done that is simply ludicrous. And I think governors tell me very often that they get new people arriving in the jail who've been recruited centrally, and they can tell really quickly that they're not appropriate. That's not good for those members of staff. It's not good for the leadership in the prison. And above all, it's not good for prisoners either to have people who don't have the skills or the aptitude for the job. So that's an absolutely typical example. But also in things like works going on within jails, there's a huge frustration about the amount of time it takes to commission and get stuff done, and that often things overrun, or that stuff's supposed to happen doesn't happen when it's supposed to. And similarly with things like education provision, where again that's commissioned centrally, and governors again are frustrated by the limited amounts of control they have on education provision. And ultimately, if there isn't more autonomy for governors, if governors aren't prepared to be able to take and put responsibility and accountability in the same place, then you can understand their frustration. I think one of the bits of my job that I find hardest is that we criticize prisons and therefore, almost by definition, governors for things that they're not necessarily accountable. They're not accountable for the quality of the education provider that comes in. They're not responsible for the recruitment of staff. They're not responsible for what's going on within probation systems out in the community and the leakage into their jails there. And it's hugely frustrating for us, but also for them that we come in and inspect them in those areas.
What 2 or 3 measures could help improve that situation, do you think, Charlie? I mean, going a little bit beyond your remit, perhaps, but are there some sort of measures that could be taken to sort of address that?
Well, I think there's some thinking to be done about how much autonomy a governor should have. And I remember a very depressing conversation with a governor. He said to me once, "I feel more like a contract manager than I do a leader." And the problem is, if you make the job about contract managers, you'll get people who like managing contracts doing it, rather than people who want to run jails, who want to motivate staff, who want to support prisoners on their journey. So that seems to me really important. So I think a focus in on the quality of leadership and how leaders can improve, but also I think on middle leadership as well. So if you compare, for example, the army and the amount of support and thought that goes into the training of sergeants and corporals within the army, and you compare that with the support that goes in for custody managers and for senior officers in jails, there just isn't any comparison. These are critical people. These are the culture carriers in prisons, the people who translate the governor's ambition into what actually happens to people when they're on the wings. And if those people aren't supported and trained in the right way, then the danger is that the culture, however good the governor is, the governor really struggles to change and improve the culture. So I think a real focus on the prison service, on the best leaders, on developing leaders and unleashing talent and giving people a chance to innovate. And sometimes what governors say to me is that some of the stuff I've done, some of the stuff that we praise them for, they've done in spite of the constraints of the prison service rather than because of it. And that can't be right.
If you joined us late, then you're watching a webinar with Charlie Taylor and myself, Danny Shaw, about the annual report of the Prison Inspectors report for 2022-2023. We're running through some of the key findings, and there will be an opportunity for Charlie to take your questions. Can you keep them coming in using the Q&A function on your keypad? And we'll try to get through as many as possible. I wanted to turn, I know you've touched on staffing, some of the staffing issues, but it is the theme that sort of underlines so many of the issues facing prisons. The current situation is slightly better than it was a year ago. There are about 22,300 band 3 to 5 officers. That is up around almost 300 on last year. And the support staff, it's about 5,300. That's up around 200 on last year. But the leaving rate for band 3 to 5 officers is 15% almost. And for support staff, it's around 19%. So still a staffing crisis, I would say. I mean, is that how you would characterize it, Charlie?
Yes, and I think what we see is that's particularly acute in different parts of the country. So we see some sort of microclimates where perhaps employment opportunities elsewhere mean that it's harder to recruit. So, for example, up the M1 corridor, prisons like Wood Hill, Bedford, Onley, and also out in the M40, jails like Aylesbury and Bullingdon, and then also jails in more remote parts of the country, places like Wayland in Norfolk and Swaleside on the Isle of Sheppey. Those seem to be areas, parts of the country that particularly struggle to be able to recruit enough people. And of course, the difficulty is if there aren't enough people to really run a proper regime, that increases the frustrations of prisoners. And the danger is that creates a cycle where you get things like increases in violence, and therefore you actually consequently lose members of staff as well. But I think the other thing that's really critical here is thinking for the prison service about the support that they give for new members of staff as well. In the past, there was a fairly steady pipeline of former services people coming into prisons who were a little bit older, perhaps had a bit more life experience. What we're seeing is some very young people coming into prisons, many who are even under 21. And those people simply will need a bit more looking after. Many of them are going to make brilliant officers, but they do need more looking after. We've seen some jails where there's some thought going into place, is going in here. So places like Featherstone, there was some good stuff going on. ISIS in London, there was some good stuff going on. But I think as a whole, this is a challenge for governors in terms of retention, but it's also a challenge for the prison service as a whole. Sometimes it feels like we still have a kind of 1950s recruitment and retention model for prisoners, for prisons. How do we make sure that we keep, there's a much bigger female population. That's been a huge benefit for prisons. But actually, female officers will want to go off and have children. How are we going to support them to come back into the workforce? How are we going to think about managing shift patterns? How do we think about making sure that with prices of petrol very high, that people are able to have shifts? That means they can share cars and those sorts of things. There are some jails who are already thinking about this, but I think it's a global problem for the prison service as well.
I mean, I know this perhaps is a little bit beyond your remit, but what about pay? Is that a factor when you from what your conversations with prison officers and other staff, what are you hearing about that?
Well, there have been pay rises recently, and I think that's one of the reasons why some of the staffing situation has been stabilised. I mean, look. Ultimately, people don't go in to become prison officers or to become prison governors because of the money. They come in because they want to support prisoners to help to change the patterns of behaviour that people have got into. But inevitably, pay is a factor for people, particularly with high levels of inflation. We are seeing some stability, and that may be to do with the pay rises, but we'll keep an eye on that in the future.
Okay, I want to turn to living conditions, which you found in through your inspections as a serious cause of concern. You mentioned some prisons in particular, Wandsworth, Pentonville in London, and Bedford and Winchester prisons, where you were very concerned. Um, what were some of the sort of the kind of the real issues that you found in those prisons? Can you give us an example of some of the things that you're really worried about?
Well, these are old Victorian prisons. I mean, I have a lanyard that says a Wandsworth prison lanyard, and it's 170 years old, and it feels like it's 170 years old when you walk around Wandsworth. So we were there during the heat wave last summer. If you're on the Fours landings at Wandsworth, it's unbelievably hot. So they can open the windows at the top of the building, but what that means is loads of pigeons get in, and they then have to put sheets all over the netting to stop the pigeons from messing up the rest of the jail. So, it's those sorts of things with those old Victorian buildings that just make it really difficult. Things like in-cell sanitation, squashed cells where prisoners are having to watch each other on the lavatory, even when they're eating meals. Those sorts of things, prisoners are really frustrated about. We go to much more modern jails. You look at the photos, for example, in our report of HMP Wayland, and that it was a lifer cell there. I think we've got a picture of, and you can see there the prisoner there had a laptop that he was able to use. That it was a prison. It looked more like almost like a sort of very small university students type room, and you can understand that prisoner has a much better opportunity to make progress. But when people are crammed into the conditions they're crammed into, I mean, just things like mattresses. You see older prisoners on mattresses that are completely worn out, and I know that I would struggle to sleep in those conditions. And they will often tell me that their backs are very sore, that they get all kinds of aches and pains as a result of it. So the whole infrastructure in many places is very tatty. And as I said before, the time it takes to get things done is often seems to be astonishingly long.
And the impact of overcrowding is clearly making that worse. I mean, the population a year ago, just under 81,000. Now it's almost 86,000, so a rise of about 5,000 in 12 months. The capacity, the official operational sort of capacity, means there are only around 1,000 spare places across all prisons. And we have remand prisoners now, I think near record numbers, around 14,000. So what is the impact that the population is having?
Well, it just adds to the pressures in prisons. We've already had to see Operation Safeguard in action, which means prisoners are staying in police cells overnight. That's not ideal. It's not ideal for the police. It's not ideal for prison transport and the people who are running and organising that. And it's not ideal for prisoners themselves. The police aren't kitted out to be able to look after prisoners on those sorts of terms. So that's a real concern. But what it just does is it compounds some of the issues that we've talked about before. So more prisoners having to share cells that were originally designed for one, particularly in those crumbly old Victorian local jails. But also it puts a greater strain on officers because they have more prisoners to deal with, and it reduces the opportunities to get prisoners out of their cells and into things like education, training, and work that we know are critical for that public protection function that stops prisoners from reoffending when they come out. So the knock-on effects are really worrying across the estate.
And all this obviously affects the preparation for prisoners for release. And you're very concerned about that. You described some of the arrangements under this OMIC model, offender management in custody, as piecemeal and tokenistic in your report, particularly in regard to IPP prisoners serving indeterminate terms. So the OMIC model isn't really working, Charlie. Would that
No,
be
no, Yeah, it was a really disappointing report we did with our colleagues in HMIP probation. And one of the key parts of OMIC was the offender management in custody was about key work. It was about each prisoner having a key worker who was going to support them in their sentence. It was someone who's going to help them to sort out issues as they came along, was going to help them to get access to the kind of courses they needed to do in order to progress with their sentence. But I can only think of a couple of prisons, Wakefield and New Hall, where we saw anything like the levels of key work that we would have wanted to see. Very often elsewhere, it seems to be pretty tokenistic stuff. It may be just a welfare check for some of the most vulnerable prisoners. It often isn't even the same officer every time, so that building relationship doesn't happen. And sometimes I've come across them being done through a cell door. Well, the idea that a prisoner is going to be able to disclose what may be confidential information when there's a conversation being shouted through a cell door is simply fanciful. So that part of the model wasn't working, but also the bit of the model that requires that you have community probation officers working within prisons in order that there's a seamless handover from the prison bit to the probation community bit. That also isn't happening either, and that's partly because and my fellow inspector of probation, Justin Russell, has been highlighting that, particularly in London, with just the lack of enough qualified probation officers in order to be able to manage those cases. And we've seen that with a couple of serious further offences that have happened in the last year or so, where prisoners have come out, they haven't been properly monitored in the community, that prisons weren't spotting the risks or putting them at the right risk level. And very sadly, they've gone on to commit some very serious further offences after they've left custody.
It's a rather depressing picture, I have to say. And in women's prisons, you highlighting sort of mental health concerns. You said many of the people there shouldn't be in prison at all. A huge amount of resources taken up by a small number of female prisoners. I mean, is there anything that can be done in a better way? Because it's a relatively small population. We're not talking, about tens of thousands of people here, are we?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a different population as well. They've got different needs, and I think they thrive in different ways from the male populations. I think some of the things that have affected male prisons have affected women's prisons as well. So particularly things like recruitment, and if there aren't enough officers on the ground, then women are spending more time locked in their cells. We know that many women really struggled during COVID, during the lockdowns in prisons during COVID, because they weren't able to socialize, they weren't able to be with friends and to be able to be with officers, and that very often they were spending large amounts of time locked up. So we're seeing not enough purposeful activity in lots of women's prisons, and also not enough officers to be able to really build those supportive relationships. And I think that inevitably may be one of the reasons why levels of self-harm have gone up. And particularly, you take a prison where we did a really worrying report on, which was Eastwood Park in Gloucestershire, where in one particular house block 4, there were women who were acutely mentally ill, some of the most distressing levels of self-harm that certainly I've come across. And the prison simply not having the capacity, the resources, the staffing, the expertise to be able to look after those prisoners, to look after those women. And some of them, quite frankly, should have been in hospital. They shouldn't have been in prison. Prison was not the right place for them. And too often we still see that, where both in the female but also in the male estate, we see people who should be in hospital who are still in prison.
What about trauma-informed prisons? You said there's a lot of talk about trauma-informed prisons, but worryingly, prison officers don't actually know what that means, which is quite a troubling finding as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these buzzwords that crops up. And look, often I talk to governors, and they will give me a really good description of what they think trauma-informed means. But if the people on the ground aren't really understanding what they mean by trauma-informed, if they're not really bought in to understanding what it is, then it just becomes a buzzword that gets thrown around prisons. You don't make yourself trauma informed by saying trauma informed a lot of times within paperwork and to inspectors. Trauma informed means really getting under the skin of prisoners, really understanding what the drivers are to offending and giving them the support they need in order to be rehabilitated. I mean, it's a new buzzword, but it's stuff that good prisons have always done well anyway. Forming good relationships, making sure prisoners have got enough to do, making sure they're linked with community, making sure family support and visits are working well. Those sorts of things are what trauma informed means. And I think sometimes these buzzwords can get in the way of what we mean, which is really good old fashioned prison practice.
Back to basics, perhaps. We're going to come on to questions in just a minute, but just one final area I want to look at is violence, and in particular in relation to the state for young people and children. I think you say in your report that everywhere you looked in young offender institutions and secure training centres, violence rates were too high, apart from Park in South Wales. What is Park doing that sets it apart from the other institutions?
Well, I'll tell you a few things about Park, actually. The first thing is that it's got it's a prison within a prison. So it's a youth prison within a very large adult male prison. But it has a director, Janet Walsgrove, who is absolutely invested in the idea of the youth part of the prison being successful. She doesn't cross-deploy staff from the youth prison into the main prison. It's had very stable leadership, both at the centre in Park, but also within the youth part of the prison as well. The staffing situation is more stable there. But there is also a real ambition at Park to get people to get the boys out of their cells and to get them into real purposeful activity. So whilst at Park we were seeing people out of their cells for 10, 12 hours a day, including at weekends, going into any other part of the YOI estate, we're seeing people locked up for 19 hours a day as an average. It's rare that people are even getting out for 6 hours a day. And that has to have a knock-on effect. And of course, the problem is if you've got these boys locked in their cells, they tend to be in single cells. They're bored out of their minds. What we often see happening is they're calling out to other prisoners on the wing. That can sometimes precipitate levels of violence. And the whole cycle just gets repeated. And the nervousness about unlocking boys just increases. But ultimately, what we need to do is get them into purposeful activity. These are energetic young men who need to be kept busy. And the idea that we're going to rehabilitate them by locking them behind their door is just fanciful.
Well, some people perhaps watching this from prisons perhaps would look at Park and say perhaps they need to take an example from there, because there are some prisons, and Park is one of them, that are performing well and showing good leadership. So
I think, sorry, Danny, just to say one thing, actually, during that reporting period, we also reported really favourably on the work that had happened at Feltham as well. And I think it's worth recognising that as the governor then, Emily Martin, had really done and her team had really done an outstanding job. And our scores for Feltham were hugely improved on what we'd seen before.
That's really encouraging to hear. So I want to come on to some questions. Keep them coming on the Q&A function. I'm going to go straight away to Andy Keane Downs, who's the Chief Executive of PACT. He says, do governors make enough use of the expertise and skills of the voluntary sector? And if not, what do you see as the obstacles?
I think one of and it's great to hear from Andy, and we know that PACT does some brilliant work in supporting families and prisoners and maintaining those relationships. One of the things that I think is a huge frustration for third sector organisations in prisons is sometimes the churn of personnel. So they built up a relationship with a governor, with a deputy governor, with senior leadership team, and they're able to work really effectively in a prison. But sometimes the turnover of senior staff in jails often makes the job of third sector organisations really difficult. And we know there's huge value added by organisations coming in. They bring light and oxygen into jails. They bring a different way of thinking and operating. And there's much good work done by third sector organisations. But sometimes it feels they're really battling just to get into jails. I think what they also talk about, and it goes back to the issues we've been talking about, staffing and regime, is that very often they get there and they find that prisoners aren't being unlocked when they're supposed to be unlocked. That there aren't enough officers to allow third sector organisations to be able to operate in the way they do. I mean, I'll give another example, an area that's enormously important to me: the teaching of reading in prisons. Well, we know the Shannon Trust does a great job in prisons. When prisoner mentors are actually unlocked and able to give each other support. But if you're only unlocked for an hour a day, or an hour or two a day, and you're a prisoner, you've got to order your canteen. You've got to make phone calls. You've got to go and have your shower, get some time outside, and actually reading just becomes deprioritized. Well, that's an absolutely classic function of prisons that they're failing to do, which is a way of stopping people from being able to get the rehabilitation that they need. If you can read better when you leave prison, you're more likely to be successful when you come out. And the frustrations that I feel from people like the Shannon Trust is really strong, just because those lockdown style regimes are still continuing in many places.
I know that reading and writing literacy is something you've written about before, you've spoken about, and it's something you feel passionately about. Do you think the message has got through to the Ministry of Justice, to the prison service, that this needs to be prioritised?
Well, every prison now has to have a reading strategy. That's an improvement. We want to see that being owned by governors, though. It needs to be something that's being driven by prison governors, not just by education providers, because this isn't just about teaching prisoners who can't read at all to read, but that's an important function. It's also about developing reading across the board. If someone's doing a 10-year sentence, actually reading can play an enormously important part of their journey through the prison, and ultimately into their rehabilitation as well. And it really worries me that someone goes in with a 4-year stretch and they come out 4 years later still unable to read. That can't be right. It's a real indictment of our prison system. There are some green shoots, but we and our colleagues in Ofsted did some follow-ups, and things aren't nearly as good as they should be. There has to be a real orientation of the prison service towards improving standards of education and improving things like the teaching of reading. Because if we want people to go out into the community, and given the nature of jobs that are out there these days, we need people to come out more educated than when they came in. And sadly, that often doesn't happen.
Okay, going to a question now from Elizabeth Davis, who's the new National Chair of the Independent Monitoring Board. How do we reconcile Charlie has captured as the governor not being accountable for everything with the outcome-based focus of inspection? Should the message to local IMBs be one of adopt a prisoner detainee-centred approach with a focus on outcomes and not on who is running, for example, the prison education contract? Can you answer that?
Yeah, I think it's a critical question. And first of all, a huge welcome to Elizabeth, who's just joined at the IMB. And I think we haven't yet met, but we're looking forward to meeting. I think this has to be about outcomes for prisoners ultimately. And I think it's very easy in prisons to talk about processes. But ultimately, if the processes don't lead to better outcomes for prisoners, then they're not fulfilling their function. And for us as inspectors, we have to keep focusing in on outcomes for prisoners. So rather than worrying about the ACT process that supports prisoners who are at risk of suicide or self-harm, what we have to understand is the extent to which prisons are really looking after those people at risk. Processes matter, but only when they drive outcomes.
Thank you for that answer. Moving on to another question now from Natasha Porter, who's the CEO of Unlocked, the graduate prison officer scheme. Natasha says, you've spoken here about senior leadership training needing to be better. And I would agree, says Natasha. Can you tell us what your thoughts are with regards to the custodial manager middle leadership group? What is working well with this group and perhaps should be rolled out across the service? So where's the best practice? Can it be rolled out?
Well, it's great to hear from Natasha and the staggeringly impressive work that she's done in setting up the Unlock Graduate Scheme has been remarkable. And we come across some brilliant people who've been recruited through that scheme into prisons, people who are making a real difference. I absolutely agree. The training for custody managers is often very patchy. They have a huge span of control in terms of the amount of people they manage. And the other frustration is that they spend large amounts of time chained to a computer, having to follow up on things like back pay through the labyrinthine MOJ internal payment system, those sorts of things. That's not a good use of their time. These are people who should be out on the wing, making sure that the new officers are being mentored, making sure that prisons are running efficiently, making sure that things are clean and tidy, that prisoners who are supposed to be are in the right place at the right time, those sorts of things. And I think we see some jails, we see some incredible practitioners. I can think of one particular custody manager at Park who'd set up a unit for veterans and young people living together. A really impressive piece of work. But I think also we see custody managers who've been thrown into positions of power without having the support and training that they need. And the danger then is that they just fall into to bad habits and things don't work. These are critical culture carriers for governors. These are the people who translate the governor's ambition into what actually happens on the wing. We know that Natasha and her people have been really thinking about what support can be given to custody managers, and it's an area that I particularly want to focus on myself in the next year. We thought a lot about and talked a lot about governors and governors' responsibilities, but I think custody managers are the other crucial cog in making sure that prisons run well and efficiently.
Thank you very much. Hopefully, Natasha, that answered your question. Next question is from Callum Walker, who's the Prisoners Education Trust. And he says, are there any changes the government are planning to make that you feel will have a positive impact? Interesting question, Callum.
Well, I think I think the changes to, I mean, let's wait and see when it comes to things like the teaching of reading. And I know the Prisoners Education Trust do much good work with prisoners in supporting education progress. But let's wait and see how this plays out in terms of teaching reading. But I would want to see a sea change in that area. I think there are some things that have gone well. I think the amount of drugs that are getting into prisons has been reduced. I think there's been an increase in the use of technology. So things like body scanners are really helping, particularly helping prisoners not getting bullied to bring stuff in. We've come across prisoners who've been forced to get themselves recalled to prisons. Those sorts of things are much harder to do because drugs are getting picked up. Better use of things like sniffer dogs, better use of things like drone detection, better searching of staff and anti-corruption type measures. That's really good, and it's really helped in a number of prisons. Places like Birmingham, we talked about at the beginning, places like Hull, places like Winchester, places like Durham that we inspected in the last cycle. We've seen some big falls of violence as a result. So that's positive. But also, it isn't just about reducing the supply of drugs in. What you've also got to focus on is reducing the demand. And the way to reduce demand is making sure that prisoners have something productive to do. They feel that there's something worth getting up for and getting out of bed in the morning, that they feel they're making progress with their sentence and they're learning the sorts of skills that are going to help them to settle down and be successful when they come out. So there's been some good work with reducing the supply of drugs into prison. That has had a knock-on effect on levels of violence. And there's been a modest but definite reduction in levels of violence. But in the future, we also have to concentrate, or the prison service needs to concentrate on reducing the demand for drugs as well.
Well, it's encouraging to hear that those security measures in terms of drugs detection are having an effect. But I just wonder whether that's whether the figures coming down is perhaps partly to do with COVID and the fall in the
without doubt,
population.
Without doubt, yeah, without doubt.
Next question is from David Dyson from Wakefield Prison. David says, the prison system is reaching capacity, and when that occurs, it is likely that governors will be instructed to overcrowd above their operational capacity. I know this is something that the Prison Governors Association has been talking about, their concerns about that. David says this would make prisons less safe and worsen conditions for the prisoners held there, who may have to double or even triple cell share. This is neither safe or decent and reduces opportunities and resources for reducing reoffending. Will the Inspectorate challenge the prison service and ministers where prisons overrun their safe operational capacity? That's a good question, Charlie.
It's a really important question, and it's a huge concern for us in the Inspectorate. I think the answer is we've been challenging the government for many years when it comes to overcrowding. This is an issue. If you went back to all of my predecessors' reports, this is something that we keep repeating. The amount of prisoners who are locked in cells that were originally built for one. In so many of the local prisons around the country, those Victorian locals that have got all kinds of issues in terms of the general infrastructure. But when it comes to two prisoners crammed in together in a 12 by 6 cell with an unscreened lavatory in the corner, that is an enormous pressure on those prisoners, and it's compounded when prisoners are being locked in their cells for longer and longer periods, for long periods of times. If they're not getting out of their cells and they're locked together for up to 22, 23 hours a day, that's a huge concern. If there are more prisoners coming in, that can only add to the pressure, both on prisoners and also on staff as well. It's already challenge enough in many prisons just to keep a basic regime going. And if there are even more prisoners spilling into prisons, then it has to raise a level of concern.
But I suppose the specific question that David is asking is if governors are instructed to go above the agreed operational capacity, will you, as Chief Inspector of Prisons, sort of step in if you're getting sort of people telling you that this is happening? Will you raise your head above the parapet?
We will see what we see on the ground. If we go into jails where overcrowding issues are even worse, then of course we'll make representations.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Keith Fraser, Chair of the Youth Justice Board. He says, Charlie, you were asked one question about children. What are the other questions that you wished you were asked, and what would be your answer?
Well, it's great to hear from my old friend Keith. He has done sterling work in the Youth Justice Board. I mean, one of the areas that Keith has been particularly focused on is the overrepresentation of Black and other ethnic minority children within the youth estate, and the outcomes for those prisoners, both in youth prisons but also in the adult estate, has been a real concern for us. So that's certainly an area that of ongoing concern. I think the regime in the youth prisons is hugely worrying. And I think also just an understanding of the level of complexity of some of the children who are coming into custody. If you think 10, 15 years ago, there were 3,500 children locked up. It's now quite hard to get sent to custody if you're a child. And what that means is children who are in prison now tend to have committed very often much more serious offences. And some of them are facing very long prison sentences. And YOIs need to think about what provision they make for those people. The other area, and we're doing some thematic work on this at the moment, is looking at the remand population within YOIs. And I won't say too much about it now because it's fairly early days on that work, but we're still seeing some children going into prison on remand for incredibly short periods of time. And that's really because the local authority or the police between them are unable to make any other sorts of provision. But it's not helpful for someone to be sent on remand for a matter of days before accommodation is found for them. Prisons are not babysitting services. They should be for people who are either remanded for serious offences or for people who are serving a sentence. The other thing I think is leadership within the youth estate. We've seen some great leaders in the youth estate, but they struggle to hang on to people because of the way the pay scales work within HMPPS. There's been some good work in terms of growing a cadre of more specialised officers, but we also need a cadre of more specialised leaders, and that continues to be, I think, a challenge where the turnover of governors remains high in most of the youth estate.
Thank you very much. Moving on to our next question is from Pia Sinha, Chief Executive, recently appointed of the Prison Reform Trust and a former governor herself. She said, Charlie, I'm curious about why, given this lack of hope and legitimacy within prisons, there isn't more disorder within the estate. You suggested that some of it was due to the fact that prisoners themselves have lost hope and have little expectation left. Are we moving towards a culture of low expectations and ambitions within the service? What an interesting question, Pia.
It's really interesting, and of course, Pia knows far more about prisons than I'll ever know, and famously did an absolutely remarkable job in turning around Liverpool jail after our appalling inspection just a few years ago. There seems to be the torpor that I talked about amongst prisoners, within prisons, that inertia within prisons, that seems to apply to many prisoners as well as to the establishment itself. I think prisoners have got used to having lower expectations, that they're locked up for long periods of time. When they're working, they haven't got much work to actually do. So I'll give you an example. You take wing cleaners. Prisons have unbelievable amounts of wing cleaners. It's a job that is popular for prisoners and is handed out to seemingly large parts of the population. And yet we still go to prisons that aren't clean enough. And what we find is wing cleaners are completely underemployed. They might do an hour's cleaning in the morning and then they just sit around for the rest of the day chatting. Well, it's very nice that prisoners are getting social time, but actually they're not really being motivated in order to get proper work when they come out. This isn't the sort of work that prisoners are likely to be offered when they come out. They're not really getting that push and drive. And I think, for some prisoners, we were recently in HMP Brinsford, a lot of young people there, and they're just whiling away their sentences, watching daytime TV and sleeping. And quite frankly, as someone who's got children of a similar age, if they're not being motivated by the establishment, the danger is that that's what children will do, and that also seems to apply to prisoners as well. So I think there's a real worry that prisoners have lost some of that, or prisons have lost some of that energy. And I think that means that prisoners simply aren't getting out and having the expectations of what it can be like being in prison, that they really feel they can make a difference. And when we go to prisons that are running well, somewhere like Oakwood in Wolverhampton, or some of the open prisons that we've recently inspected, Ford was a good example. You can really see how prisoners can be inspired. But if there's nothing there to inspire them, the temptation to just sit around, to take drugs if they're available, becomes much higher. So, Pia makes a really important point, and we need to watch this space in the next few years, and with our colleagues at the PRT, to make sure that things do move on.
Thank you for that question and answer. Just the last 5 minutes or so, just try and squeeze in a couple more. Nina Champion, Director of the Criminal Justice Alliance, says, it appears to me that there is some good work happening with technology in prisons, but it is mainly piecemeal pilots. What more needs to be done to move prisons into the 21st century to improve the digital skills of people in prison, access to education courses, access to external agencies and employers, etc.?
Well, it's great to hear from Nina, and we know that her organisation does some great work, particularly some of the reporting they've done on race recently, which has been really important. I think there was a bit of a tech breakthrough with prisons, where during COVID they introduced what was known as purple visits, video calling. That was a real one of the few bonuses that came from the lockdowns, and we're seeing some jails, Feltham B, Wayland, where prisoners have got laptops and they're able to use them, but the functionality is very limited. So they can order their canteen. Sometimes they can do things like book visits, put in applications. But in terms of the opportunities for things like learning, there are loads you could do. So I was recently talking to a school-based reading expert who was talking about opportunities for doing things like being able to teach reading through tech. You can understand some of the nervousness within the prison service about technology and some of the potential risks. But I think there's a huge opportunity to go much further when it comes to technology. But I would just add one thing on this, though, Danny, which is that technology mustn't be a substitute for face-to-face contact, because that's enormously important for prisoners. You can't do everything online. And one of the ways that we need to support prisoners on their journey to change is by that face-to-face contact with really high-quality professionals who are going to help to look after them.
I want to squeeze in this question from Stuart Ross from the Home Office, because we haven't really talked at all about the immigration estate and detention, which obviously is part of your remit as well. Stuart says the knock-on effect of limited capacity overcrowding in the prison estate will have direct implications for the immigration removal centres and detention estate. Do you have concerns about this? And perhaps also, Charlie, you might want to just quickly outline some of the findings that you've made in terms of immigration detention.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, I'll start by saying that we did a thematic report looking at the outcomes for prisoners who were beyond their tariff, who were remaining in prisons rather than in immigration removal centres. And what we came across were prisoners who were told very late on in their sentence that actually they weren't going to be released the day they thought they were going to be released. One guy told me he on the day his parents were waiting for him outside the jail, and suddenly he was given what's called an IS-91 form and told that actually he wasn't being released at all because he was potentially subjected to deportation. So that's a real concern, because if we've got pressure on prison places, what we shouldn't have is lots of people in prison who are still over tariff. But of course, if you're moving them out from prisons, you're moving into the immigration estate, and that has its own population pressures. During COVID, numbers fell to almost nothing, but they're going up again. The other concern is about the nature of people who are ending up in the immigration estate, particularly with severe mental health problems, whose illnesses are being compounded by being locked up without any sense of how long it'll be for. At least if you're a prisoner, once you're sentenced, at least you have a rough idea of when you are likely to be able to get out. But we're still seeing people spending too long within immigration removal centres. And then finally, just to say a little bit about the facilities at Manston and down on the south coast, we were concerned, but also quite positive about what we found in Manston in our inspection there in August last year. But we also flagged up a number of risks. Those were particularly about healthcare and the danger of overcrowding and people spending too long in facilities that simply weren't suitable. It's people sleeping on mats with blankets on the floor. Well, what we saw during October was the number of people in Manston went up significantly. That people were being locked in Manston for weeks on end rather than for the 24 hours that it's supposed to be for, because there was a problem with bottlenecks of getting people into hotels. That remains a real concern for us. We went back to Manston in February, and again, the numbers of people there were relatively low, as they've continued to be recently. But I remain concerned that if the numbers at Manston increase like they have done in the past, the pressures we saw during October last year will simply occur again. The pipeline has to be managed effectively in order that people don't spend long periods of time in facilities that are simply not appropriate. We wouldn't put up with prisoners sleeping on floors without beds, and we shouldn't put up with immigration detainees in those same circumstances either.
Charlie, I think it's a very strong note to finish on. We've still got some more questions to come, but we haven't really got time to take them, but they will be answered. Rest assured, the inspectorate team will answer those questions if they haven't been answered. So thank you very much, Charlie Taylor, for answering your questions and giving us an update from your annual report. It's available on the Justice Inspectorate website, on the Prison Inspectorate website, 116 pages. It's a fascinating read, I have to say, and a really good summary of the situation in prisons across England and Wales if you want to look at it. And also a recording of this webinar will be made available on the website, hopefully later today, if you want to watch it again or if you've missed some of it. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Charlie Taylor. And from me, Danny Shaw, that's it. Goodbye.
Thanks very much, Danny.